Thank you to everybody for joining. My name is Dave Gallagher. I'm a member of the Board of Regents, class of 91 graduate from the undergraduate business school. We've got a great panel today, hopefully a very exciting discussion. This is, as some of you may know, we've been hosting a series of these webinar events over the course of the fall semester. This is the fourth of 5. They've covered various topical issues, including the U.S. election, the pandemic. There's one coming up on Asia later in December. So thank you again to everyone for joining us. Before we get going, I think what we'd like to do is to run a quick poll so that we have a sense of who's joined us from where in terms of undergraduates, alumni, parents, and where in the world you might be located. So I think Yvonne will put a quick poll on the screen if people will be kind enough to respond to that, and we can get going soon after that. All right, so we have the results. Just to give you a sense, we've got 67% of the audience today are alumni, 21% students, and 13% parents. Pretty even mix across schools, I would say. And then I don't see locations or anything, so we'll have to go through that later. But thank you to everyone for joining from multiple corners of the world, as we know. Hopefully you'll find this to be an interesting discussion today. The topic that we're covering today is the energy transition and ESG, or environmental, social and governance considerations. And this is a topic, obviously, that's been, that many of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with, and something that has been in the news. I think we've got a very distinguished panel today of friends and colleagues, and in one case, in Jeff's case, a classmate and friend, a fellow Georgetown alum. So I gave you my Georgetown credentials, but maybe just quick professional background. I work at a company called Mercuria Energy Trading, which is one of the largest commodity trading firms in the world. I run our structuring and investments business, originally from the US, but I'm based now in London for the last 11 or so years. So Jeff, maybe turn it over to you. You can give a quick intro, and then we'll pass it down the line.
Sure. Jeff Morrell, class of 91 with Dave. I too am in London, an American here, been here for 3 years. I came over with BP because I run for them sort of their global government relations and communications operation. Thrilled to be here and happy to contribute to the panel. And I coerced my good friend and colleague, Spencer Dale, to join us. So maybe he can introduce himself, but he'll probably be far too humble. But he's the former chief economist at the Bank of England, and he is now the chief economist for BP. Anything to add, Spencer?
That's a wonderful thing when you have friends like Jeff. He does the introductions for you. So no, I'll stop there. And that's very good. Thank you, Jeff.
Oh, now I feel the need to do the same for you, Victoria. So, Victoria Atwood Scott is a good friend and colleague of mine now for several years, both at Mercuria and then our previous lives at Goldman Sachs. She's our global head of compliance, but I think her remit runs far beyond that. So Victoria, I don't know if you want to say a few words on what you cover at Mercuria.
Sure. Yeah, I initially came in, joined Mercuria to run the global compliance team, but as Dave mentioned, the remit has grown. I think as ESG has become a much bigger consideration for us as an energy company, I've sort of assumed the role of sort of ESG and sustainability within the company as well.
Great, thanks. So maybe that's a good place to start then, because I think everyone in the audience today is probably very familiar with the amazing developments that are taking place in terms of energy transition, renewable energy, the move, the slow but inevitable move away from hydrocarbons. But I guess maybe a question for the panelists is, how do we define ESG? Because I think it covers a broad set of considerations and issues beyond just renewable energy. So Victoria, do you want to start with that?
Sure, absolutely. I think, ESG and climate change tend to be used a little bit interchangeably, but actually they're two quite different things. And climate change really just is a part of ESG, which is a much bigger subject. But I think it's impossible to think about one without considering the other. And I'm sure we'll come on to speak a little bit more in detail. Climate change is something that, although we read it everywhere and see it everywhere today, 6 or 7 years ago, it's something that wasn't really discussed to any great length. It really has been a sort of a very new emergence that's come out of the ESG space in recent years. But I think, as we focus on the energy transition and how we move towards cleaner and greener energies, there's a lot of social issues that we need to consider around the world as well, because they do have impacts on one another, both in terms of the energies that we leave behind, but also in terms of the use of more raw materials, as we progress towards cleaner energies that have other social and governance issues attached to them.
Thanks. Jeff and Spencer, do you guys want to touch on your perspectives within BP on the topic?
So I don't work deeply in sort of an ESG investment space. So it sort of caused me to think, this session sort of caused me to think a little bit and say, well, what does it mean? And I think it means that a successful company needs to care and value aspects of its performance and activities other than simply maximizing profits. So it needs to care in terms of its footprint, in terms of the environment, its social footprint, and its governance. Now, at one level, that sounds, of course. But it's, especially for students, it's worth remembering for the last 50 years, that has not been the dominant paradigm. The dominant paradigm for the last 50 years is the role of companies is within the laws of the land to maximize shareholder profits. That's what the world was. And it's interesting that that paradigm stems from Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize, and it's the so-called Friedman Doctrine. And if for any students, I actually went and read the Friedman Doctrine it was an article in the New York Times 50 years ago in September, and it's a great read. It's a pretty short read, and he makes the point that for many companies like BP, we don't own BP, and people like Jeff run BP on behalf of shareholders. So if we start diverting money into things that we think are important, charities, aid, or so on, then you're spending shareholder money. Why should you be, what right have you got to spend shareholder money? Surely your job, there's the Friedman Doctrine, is to maximize shareholder value, give it back to shareholders, and then they can spend it however they like. And if they want to care about this bit of charity or that bit of the social environment, that's what they should do. And that's a dominant paradigm. Now, this day and age, it seems like, well, that seems crazy, right? To only care about that. And I think it seems crazy because the world doesn't perform like beautiful economic models, which is what the doctrine is based on. One is markets fail all the time, all over the place, and so profit isn't a good descriptor of value. So, for example, the point Victoria is making in terms of climate change, the cost of the carbon emissions and the climate change associated with burning fossil fuels is not fully reflected in the price, and so that's not sufficient. People like you and I, we care about things other than just maximizing our earnings. We care about the type of company we work for, the type of company we invest in, and so they're not easily captured by a simple profit maximization story, which is why you need an ESG thing. But I think it's not a bad, having that Friedman Doctrine on your shoulder isn't a bad thing for executives to have, I think. So every time you find yourself being deviated and pulled away to do something other than maximize the value of the assets that you're responsible for running, you should say, is that legitimate for me to do that? Or perhaps I should just give it back to them and they can decide what to do with it. So I think that's what it is. You care about other things. You care about other things because the world is far more complicated than simple economic models, but it's not a bad thing to have in the back of your mind to keep you, if you start deviating too far away from just maximizing the value of the assets that you run on behalf of somebody else. Sorry, that's a really long answer. I apologize.
No, that was great. Thank you. I mean, I think probably a very good segue into maybe to hand it to Jeff is that as the face of BP, facing off with the communications to public stakeholders, what is it that you're hearing from the stakeholders of BP, and how is that driving how the company responds on this issue?
Yeah, I had no appreciation for ESG. I didn't know what it meant, never even heard of it, frankly, until I moved over to London to take this job about 3 years ago. And part of it was perhaps the new responsibilities, but I think part of it is just a geographic divide, right? These issues are far more acute and pronounced in Europe and here in the UK than they are in the US. I never had an appreciation for the level of societal pressure there is on companies to do far more, as Spencer says, than deliver a reliable product and a good return for shareholders. The expectations are far higher. And I think they are partly, this is a personal opinion, partly rooted in the fact that people are frustrated that governments have not solved some of these intractable problems like income inequality and gender disparities in the workplace and things of that nature. So they are pressuring companies in very clever ways to help governments solve these problems, to step up and address them. And it's everything from, we've experienced it all. Our office has been shut down by picketers, by Greenpeace. We've had shareholder resolutions that have been put to vote trying to micromanage the company's affairs. But ultimately, to answer your question, Dave, what we discovered as we made a transition from our last CEO to a new one this year, he did a lot of reflection and he said, we are simply out of step with society today. And that is not a sustainable place to be. And so we had to change. And so we have spent this year changing this company in a fundamental way. And what we set out was a new purpose for the company, a new ambition to be net zero by 2050 or sooner. We came out with very clear aims that would guide us and hold us to account to get there. We launched a new strategy just a couple of months ago, and we are in the process of reinventing the company. And there is no question that ESG, societal pressure, had a huge influence on this. So it is a powerful force that I wasn't fully appreciative of until I moved over here, frankly.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Okay, so now that we've made our best attempt at defining it, maybe let's talk about practical steps. And maybe Spencer, you can start on this. Is it what are we seeing in terms of the energy transition and the change in the energy mix globally, and what's driving that?
So the world is gradually shifting to a less carbon intensive fuel mix. Over the last few years, renewable energy, wind and solar power has grown by far more quickly, both in growth rates and volume terms, than any other source of energy. It looks increasingly likely that coal consumption in the world has already peaked. It looks like it peaked in around 2013. It fell back. It's come back a bit, but it hasn't got back to that level, and most projections wouldn't have it coming back. So the world is gradually shifting to a lower carbon fuel mix, but at the moment it's shifting far too slowly. And so the path we're on at the moment is an unsustainable path. The carbon emissions, so if you think about those Paris climate goals, we need carbon emissions in the world to get to net zero. To achieve, to stop temperatures rising more than 1.5 degrees, which is sort of the aspiration of Paris, they need to get to net zero roughly by about 2050. Okay, so we've got about 30 years to make progress. Carbon emissions at the moment are still rising. If I look at the sum of the targets which governments signed up to in Paris, those sum of targets amount to carbon emissions continuing to rise. So things are getting bad less quickly, but they're still getting bad. And that's why we need a very decisive shift to get onto a far more sustainable path. You can tell me, you can see I'm a very popular, happy-go-lucky guy in BP.
Right. So just maybe a quick follow-on on that point is you touched on coal, and I think that's a very interesting topic because you're right that coal, and I think I'll ask Victoria to comment on this in a moment, because I think we see this in terms of some of our key stakeholders in Mercuria, which are the lending banks. Coal has clearly been de-emphasized because of societal pressures, because it's a dirty fuel. But I think also in some cases it's been removed from the mix, or its importance in the mix has declined for economic factors, which is the increased discoveries of natural gas globally, and the fact that natural gas is a cheaper, more efficient fuel for power generation. So can you comment on that?
That's absolutely right. And for example, in the UK, coal has been almost eliminated from the power sector in the UK. That's less to do with large reserves of natural gas. That's more to do with effectively a carbon price, a price on carbon, penalizing coal relative to gas. In the US, the huge growth of natural gas has caused the price of natural gas to fall relative to coal, and that's led to a very significant crowding out of coal. The one thing I'd hesitate here is to take lessons from Europe and America and then apply them to the rest of the world and say, therefore, it's bad everywhere. So we just recently produced our energy outlook, which looks at energy trends over the next 30 years and does various different scenarios. And we held a magnifying glass up to the Indian power sector. And we had we looked at a scenario in which was consistent with the world meeting the Paris climate goals. And in India, it had the share of coal in the power sector falling from around 75% to 10%. It had renewables growing by about 40-fold over the next 30 years. So you look at this and say, well, that's remarkable, that's fantastic. But in that scenario, coal-fired power generation increased by 1/3 over the first 10 years of the outlook. And the reason why is because there's two things in countries like India, and it's not just India. They start with very large levels of coal, and they start with, and really importantly, which is different to the UK, it's different to America, their energy demand is growing very rapidly. So to grow renewable energy sufficiently quickly to both meet all the growth of power demand and take out coal, which you need to do, is a very, very hard thing to do. And so I'm slightly nervous when we sit here in the West, where we all have access to power, and our overall power demand is not growing very much, and so it's very relatively easy to decarbonize the power system, and demonize other countries in the world where they still do that. And so there are solutions to that, but even in a scenario entirely consistent with Paris, in a world where there's enormous decarbonisation in India, that scenario still had growth in coal-fired power generation over the next 10 years. So we should think about taking our lessons from one part of the developed world and applying it to the emerging world, which is a very different story.
Right. Yeah, and Victoria, maybe you can touch on this, because you and I actually spoke offline about this very topic the other day, and this I think sort of speaks to the S in ESG.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more about, it's very difficult to take one rule and apply it globally, because the reality is the world's different, and there's different infrastructures, and there's different, available resources, etc. And I think that one of the things that we've seen, a growing trend, and as Jeff mentioned earlier, really this is being very much driven out of Europe, and particularly France, and particularly the Netherlands, is our financiers who, as a commodity trading company, we're absolutely, they're our lifeline. They're what keep us alive. So we do what our financiers tell us to do, because we need that cash. And really, they're using that sort of position to say to companies like ourselves, say to traders like ourselves, we don't want you in coal. We don't want to finance coal. We have different extremes depending on banks, but we have many banks that are saying, if you have any coal activities within your portfolio, we don't want you on our client base anymore. Many of the French banks and the Dutch banks are saying, you have to have less than 5% of your turnover related to coal activities, otherwise, we're not going to finance you anymore. So there's a very, very aggressive push from the European banking system to push international trading companies such as ourselves out of these types of activities. And this goes a little bit to what I mentioned earlier in terms of the SG in ESG. We are actually the owner of a coal mine in Indonesia, and we get a fair amount of pressure from people saying, we really want you out of that business. It's not an easy question to step out of that business, because we can do two things. We can sell that coal mine, we can walk away, and one of two scenarios will happen. The coal mine will be bought, likely by somebody who doesn't have the pressure that companies like ourselves have from international banks. So likely from a company that probably cares less about ESG issues and less about a lot of the human rights issues that companies such as ourselves spend a lot of time focusing on in terms of the workforces and the communities around these facilities. So that's one scenario. The second scenario, of course, is the coal mine just stops producing because nobody's prepared to finance, nobody's prepared to own that business anymore. And then again, these facilities, there are entire communities that are dependent on that infrastructure. The entire communities are housed and fed by and educated by the funds that come out of that coal mine. You know, what comes with owning one of these facilities in some of these locations is a huge CSR program around that facility, educating children, building schools, building hospitals, etc. So if we walk away from these facilities, there are very real social impacts that we need to think about and consider before we do that.
Just, Dave, if I may, just to add to Victoria's point, just make it a bit blunter, the average American today consumes around 12 times more energy than the average Indian person today. So when you're trying to think about solving climate change, it seems slightly odd to start in India.
Right. That's a very good point. And I think on somewhat of a related point, and this is somewhat topical, I happen to have a conference call this morning with one of our banks, where they were presenting to us on the work that's being done across battery technology as it relates to electric vehicles. And, you know, it's quite fascinating when you think about, particularly in Europe, the pressure on the electrification. You know, we all know that we have, you know, if any of us drive in London, we incur a fairly substantial cost if we take a diesel or petrol vehicle into a particular part of town. So there's a big pressure towards the electrification of vehicles. And with that comes the whole value chain, from the point of production of the minerals that go into the batteries, to the development of the batteries, to the infrastructure supporting it. And one of the key things that came up from a societal and geopolitical standpoint was the vast majority of the world's cobalt, which is a significant input into batteries, is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there were great concerns at the banks and at many of these companies around the mining conditions, corruption, just general geopolitical considerations. So Victoria, if you want to maybe add to that as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think you know, the energy transition is happening too slowly, that's for sure. And you know, this external pressure from stakeholders is certainly helpful in speeding it up, which we do need to do. But one of the things that we do need to make sure is that we fully understand these technologies and their impacts. Because on the one hand, as you say, you know, buying an electric car is great. You know, I'm decarbonizing my car. I don't need those dirty fuels anymore. But actually, if to build that electric car, I need cobalt and you know, lithium and various other raw minerals that need to be dug out the ground, and often are dug out in jurisdictions and working conditions that you know, from a social perspective are quite difficult. It's important to understand the full picture before we make these big decisions.
Dave, can I just, because it sounds like, I can imagine people listening, it sounds a bit like a counsel of despair, this, and I don't think it's a counsel of despair. I mean, I think to make 2 points. One is caring about things other than profits, caring about the holistic footprint of companies has to be the right thing to do. And as Jeff said, 5 or 10 years ago, this was niche. This is not niche anymore. And over time, we will get better and better at it. So beware simplistic binary, this is wrong, this is right. But the idea that we're getting but we will get better at doing this. The other thing, just to pick up on Victoria's point, I think this is one of the things which I've been most surprised about over the last few years, which is that societal demand for change on carbon and climate has actually moved more quickly and further ahead than many governments around the world. So we see the investment community, we see our customers, we see our school children demanding change more quickly. And as an economist, we often talk about, you want to put a price on carbon, you don't like carbon, you put a price on carbon, and you look to governments putting a price on carbon. Today, the implied price that a very large technology company will be willing to pay for carbon-free energy, and the premium they'd be willing to pay for that carbon-free energy, means the carbon price that they are willing to pay is far, far greater than the government is imposing. And as a result of which is driving change more quickly than governments. And governments, if you like, can just validate that process rather than have to lead that process. And I think that you can see it. And so that sort of, if you like, a voluntary cost of carbon, I think has really increased and is making a big change to society. And that's directly related to ESG. And so this is having a really big positive benefit. So it's not all doom and gloom type thing.
Yeah, I think it's very important to point that out. I think that we have to acknowledge the incredible momentum and incredible pressure that's really driven. This is a topical discussion, and it might be one that we wouldn't have had 3 years ago, but because of the acceleration of public perception and really mainly a new generation focused on this as a critical issue, we have to acknowledge that it's moving in that direction, and we have to try to find our way through the various roadblocks and constraints and challenges that we'll inevitably face. Jeff, I guess on the point of governments, I mean, I know that within your remit also falls on the interaction with government entities that BP has, and I'm curious for your views on that, because the public and the shareholders have clearly driven this and somewhat taken it out of the hands of government to a certain extent, but government still plays a key role. So if you can maybe speak to how you see that interaction.
Well, as we all know, governments are under enormous pressure themselves these days, right? They are dealing with a global economy that's come to a standstill that is putting an even greater burden on treasuries than they already were under. So they are they're despairing a bit. Speaking of despair right now, so they're already under pressure. Society is frustrated with their inaction in this space. So they are, I think, being very, in many parts, particularly in Europe, being very responsive to constituent pressure in this regard. So we are getting it, not just from shareholders, not just from society, but we're getting it from governments as well. I mean, I think fundamentally the way we look at it, though, and just again to uplift the conversation a little bit, is yes, there are the scientific realities. The world has a finite carbon budget, and it's running out fast. Number two, politically, it seems there's certain momentum in this space. If Biden wins, as it looks increasingly likely, 2/3 of the world's emissions will be coming from countries that have net zero by 2050 ambitions. And then, you've also got, as Spencer can speak to much better than I do, a real changing mix and market in this regard, because renewables are becoming so much more cost competitive. And society, people, consumers increasingly want not just reliable and affordable energy, clean energy, and that's not unique to the West. We see that all around the world, not just the wealthy and nations, but developing ones as well. So we look at all that and we say, yes, the right thing to do for the world is to change, but there's also enormous opportunity financially for our shareholders by embracing this change. And Spencer can speak to the exact numbers again, but there are, it will likely cost trillions of dollars over the ensuing years to rewire the global energy system to account for the new fuel mix. There's got to be tremendous opportunity in that. You see all this movement of investor capital into ESG funds. They're looking for a home for that money. They're looking for companies that want to do the right thing. For us, and as well as you know this, and our cost of capital for pursuing those projects is so much cheaper than it is if we were to pursue traditional hydrocarbon projects. So we are embracing this change, but the reality, and the one caution I put on it is, in order for a company like us, after 111 years producing essentially nothing but oil and gas, to make this change, can't flip a switch overnight and do it. Our traditional hydrocarbon business is going to shrink. We're the only company that said this. We're going to shrink oil and gas production by 40% over the next 10 years. Big step. But that business has got to fuel our transition. The capital we make from that business is going to be reinvested in the new stuff. But we can't flip the switch. We need to sort of run that business really well in order for us to become a more diversified energy company and provide the solutions that the world increasingly wants.
Right, exactly. So one of those, I think, related to that, and again, I feel like I'm the harbinger of doom because I keep pointing out the flaws in the equation. But maybe if we could touch on, when we think about the entire energy value chain, it's well and good to have solar and wind production, and that is, as Spencer had pointed out, there's been an incredible amount of investment globally that's gone into that. But we all know that the sun doesn't shine sometimes and the wind doesn't blow sometimes. And along the value chain, everything from battery technology through to charging infrastructure, Speak a little bit, Spencer, if you would, to the investment that's required along the value chain to ensure that this energy can get to market efficiently.
Yeah, so it's we will need enormous investment, and the way, the sort of intuition for those who don't work in this space. If you gave 10 energy economists a piece of paper and say, write down your blueprint for how to get to net zero. Step one, and I thought 9 out of 10, even if they're economists, but they never agree on anything. Step one would be decarbonize your power sector. So make carbon-free electricity and electrify everything you possibly can. Okay, and that's what you do to start with. And then once you've done that, you can get on to other things. And so how do you electrify? How do you decarbonize the electricity you produce? How do you produce carbon-free electricity? And the cheapest, most viable thing looks to be the vast majority of that should come from wind and solar power. And so you just need phenomenal growth in wind and solar power around the world to try, because today wind and solar power provide, in total energy, less than 5% of the world's energy. Okay, so it's tiny today. And so you need phenomenal growth in wind and solar power. Now, your point, Dave, is that wind and solar, sometimes the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, and so there's the problems of intermittency, and that leads to issues. It does, and there's solutions to that. So you can use battery storage for very short-term issues. If it just doesn't blow for a few seconds or a few minutes, you can use batteries. Over sort of longer periods, like days, weeks, or in the Northern Hemisphere, seasons, because the demand changes very significantly in seasons. You need other things. So you can use natural gas combined with something called carbon capture, use and storage, which again, in essence, means you burn the gas, the natural gas, but you capture the carbon and then you store it safely underground. Or you can use so-called clean hydrogen, blue or green hydrogen is another technology. The point here is that will need enormous amounts. We think something of the order of between 500 and 700 billion dollars a year needs to be invested just in wind and solar power capacity. So that's not even doing the rewiring along the value chain, but just that bit to be consistent with achieving that sort of Paris outcome. The point is that those costs of intermittency, we don't think get really big until wind and solar power get to the order of about 60% of power generation. It's nowhere near that in most parts of the world. So for most parts of the world, it can just grow very strong. But beyond that, it becomes about the broader balancing of the energy system. I have a nice. So yes, we need that investment. The intermittency issue will become an issue over time, but for the foreseeable future, is not something I think which should hold back that very rapid growth in wind and solar power.
Victoria, I know another thing similar that you and I had spoken about at length, and this is an important issue for people in our part of the value chain is, and I think across the value chain is how do we create a measurement stick, if you will, in terms of carbon footprint? So we always talk about companies reducing their carbon footprint. And one of the things that I think is not well known is there's no common methodology in order to arrive at that. So that comparing apples to apples becomes quite challenging. I think you're on mute, Victoria.
Apologies, sorry. That's right, David. And for the first time at Mercuria, we calculated our carbon emissions for 2019, for the year 2019. Obviously, as a trading company, the bulk of those emissions come from our vessels, which are moving around the world, moving product around the world. When we first looked at this, there are a number of different formulas for calculating carbon emissions. We actually ran our data through 3 of those formulas to just get an idea as to how similar they were and what the results looked like. And we had variances of 25–30% just by using different calculators and different methodologies to run those numbers. So one of the things that it highlighted to us is that it's all very well companies publishing numbers and telling you this is what my emission looks like, But if you don't have any sort of depth as to the methodology, if there's no standardization, it's very difficult to actually benchmark companies and help companies to reduce. So one of the things that we're a huge proponent of is coming up with something that is standard for the market, that that means that we all run through the same methodology, and then we understand the results a lot better and can do more with them. I think once we'd run this data and once we chose our formula and we ran everything through, we worked with a startup company this year, a company called Carbon Chain, who are a sort of Silicon Valley startup, a couple of ex-Amazon guys. And we said to them, take this data, take our shipping data and automate it. We'll give you the inputs, we'll give you all of the pieces of information, and you run it through its system. But in order to do that and to do it in an automated way rather than a manual way, there's a lot of assumptions that system has to make. So what we decided to do was to rerun our 2019 numbers once we built this pilot with them. The idea being that this pilot we can tack it onto our ship tracking systems, because we're tracking our vessels around the world anyway. And so we reran the numbers and we reran the data, and actually we came out with a differential of about 35%. We were actually more conservative, so we were comfortable with the numbers we published, but there was a huge differential versus running the same numbers with using assumptions rather than the actual manual data. And this is something that's really become a very hot topic for us, because clearly, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of interest from our stakeholders, banks, etc., to understand what our emissions accounting numbers look like. And that question that we've put to the financiers now is, look, we have these two methodologies. We can do this manual calculation, which is fine. We get all the data and we run the system, but you're putting a lot of trust in us as a company that we're doing this properly, that we're not making mistakes. And at the end of it, you get a number which is accurate in terms of our emissions, but is inconsistent with anyone else in the market. And clearly, as a financier, you're financing everyone in the market. Or we have the option to use an automated system, which is not going to give you as accurate results because of the assumptions that are built into the system. However, it gives you a much better ability to benchmark and compare between all of your client base. And that's something that we put to the financiers and said, which do you prefer? What do you want to see as a publication from us, your client base? And each of those financiers now is thinking about that, and I think it's raised a really big question for them, one that we've yet to answer, and we're still working through. But I think standardization is very, very important, and that's something that we really support. I think it's something, because of the amount of time it takes for legislation to do it, it's something that the market really has to come together and do as an industry.
And that tension, Victoria, gets back to that same point we were saying earlier. If you're an investor, the best thing you'd like to do is look at a single piece of paper and say which companies have a tick by them and which ones have a cross by them. And that's what you want, right? But as soon as you have a tick and cross type thing, all that subtleties that we were saying earlier about why the world's not simplistic and binary and the 0-1 rear their heads. And so there is this inherent tension in ESG, like many other things, which is you want standardization, so then investors can look easily across. But as soon as you have standardization, all the nuances, which are legitimate nuances about, is coal good or bad? Well, it depends. No, I want a tick or a cross. And this is the difficulty, and we will just have to become. But there's hope. Okay, so when we go to the supermarket and we look at food labels, the labels on food are very sophisticated now. They will tell you where the food was produced. It will tell you the different components to it, and we are used to looking at quite sophisticated things. We just don't think fruit is fruit or an apple is an apple. We think quite hard. There's a lot of, and so I think over time, the way we will consume our energy will become more sophisticated, and the labels will become more sophisticated, and the investors will have that as well. But there is this tension. Standardization is great, but it means you sort of end up a little bit in good or bad, black and white type territory, which is the trickiness.
So before we turn to questions, I'll maybe preempt a question that's probably on the lips of many of the students, at least out there, which is, given this enormous shift that's taking place, seismic shift really in the energy economy globally, what opportunities exist for the next generation from an employment standpoint, and how can they launch their careers in various new ways as this changes? Jeff, you want to take the first crack at that?
Sure. I mean, I am not, unlike most of Spencer and I's colleagues here, I'm not a lifelong oil and gas man. I've only been with the company about 9 years. Spencer came not long after I did. And most of our colleagues joined, I think, because they wanted to see the world. They wanted to be involved in a really impactful business that has really fueled the global economy for generations. There was this nexus between energy and security and geopolitics that made it very interesting. I don't think any of that changes as the energy mix changes. This is still a hugely exciting business, perhaps more so because there is so much change going on. There is so much technological advancement going on. There is, the super majors, if you will, are no longer in any way monolithic in their approach to this business. We are all changing and becoming increasingly competitive and different from one another. So I would still encourage people, and in fact, we need, really bright, conscientious people who care about the world to go into this business and help us reinvent ourselves, help us get out of our past and into our future. So I think it's still a great opportunity to have a terrific impact on the world, still keeping the global economy going, but keeping it going, hopefully, in better and better ways.
I would agree entirely. Okay, so maybe we can turn to questions from the audience at this point. You can either, if you're comfortable, raise your hand and come on the video and ask live, or feel free to just put it in the chat as well. I see a few questions have come in the chat, so maybe I'll start with those. For Benoit Simon, he asked, what are your views on shifting to hydrogen as both a transition using blue hydrogen to green hydrogen produced by green electricity? So Spencer, I know you touched on this briefly, but maybe you could share some views on hydrogen.
So if you remember, Mike, I got my 10 energy economists. They've written down blueprint 1, which is decarbonize power and electrify everything you possibly can. That's great. But we think roughly only about 2/3 of the world's energy uses can be electrified. So we can electrify cars. Electrifying the planes that you and Jeff fly backwards and forwards from America on will be a lot harder thing to do. In the old days. Electrifying high temperature heat processes is a very hard thing to do. So we need other types of energy and energy carriers. And hydrogen as an energy carrier has a key role to play there. We think particularly in terms of industry, in terms of high temperature heat processes in industry, and also in long distance transportation, particularly we think in terms of road transportation, so that's heavy duty trucks, perhaps also submarine transportation. Hydrogen is an energy carrier, so it's not a source of energy. You're extracting that energy from somewhere else. At the moment, there's all these color codes, and there's, as in everything, there's terminology everywhere. So there's so-called green hydrogen, and green hydrogen is typically you take that decarbonized electricity, and then you use that to power an electrolyzer that extracts the hydrogen from water. So electrolysis of water. The other so-called blue hydrogen is you take natural gas, you extract the methane from natural gas, and you capture the carbon emissions using that CCUS technology. My own view is, in the world, we should be colorblind. What we care about is clean hydrogen, and I don't really care if it's made with green or it's made with blue. I care when it's making it carbon free. But then we'd use whatever the cheapest source is available. Today, most parts of the world, you can produce blue hydrogen more cheaply than green. You look overhead in the next 30 years, we think the cost of green hydrogen will fall very sharply relative to blue. And so green hydrogen will then start to become more competitive. My best guess is we fast forward 20 or 30 years, if we're on that pathway towards Paris goals, hydrogen will be playing a more significant role, and there will be a very strong mix of blue and green hydrogen being produced.
Great, thank you. Victoria, a question from Bernie Baskin, following up on your point about carbon footprint and measurement. Do you see a possibility to standardize globally? Is this possible through multilateral agreements, or do you expect more regional standardization to take place in the near term?
I would hope globally. I mean, coming from a global commodity trading company where we really don't have any regional barriers, you know, I can pick up a cargo of crude in the UK and sail it to the US or to Asia or wherever. So I would hope globally. My hope is that the industry will come together and do something, and come up with a way of you know, running these calculations, etc. I think that we have seen, you know, I mean, if we take IMO 2020, for example, that was a piece of legislation which forced you know, the maritime industry to go to a lower sulfur environment. That has been hugely successful. It was a very complicated sort of, you know, process to get into place, and it had its bumps along the way in its implementation. But that's a really good example to look at of how the world can work well and come up with a solution to sort of make things a bit cleaner and greener. So hopefully we can see more initiatives like that for sure.
Okay, question from Quinton Driesman. What role do you see for gasification in the future? Spencer, would you like to field that?
So I think in gasification, Quintin, I assume that means in terms of liquefied natural gas. Is that your interpretation, Dave, of the question? Is that?
So, or it could be, yeah, I would say probably.
So Quintin, if it's not liquefied natural gas, I apologize and quickly
correct us in the chat if you'd like.
In the chat. But let me go along the liquefied natural gas for now. So for those who aren't familiar with liquefied natural gas, essentially you take natural gas, you cool it to very low temperatures so it liquefies. Then that means you can compress it a lot more, so you can put it in ships. And then you can start, or vessels, sorry, Victoria, and then you can start transporting it all around the world. So what it's done, it has allowed people to access natural gas in parts of the world which don't have access domestically far easier, far more cheaply. And I think it will play a absolutely critical role if we're going to decarbonize the energy system. And going back to my story of that Indian power sector earlier, one way I could have stopped that coal generation increasing is I increase my gas generation for a period of time. Gas, when you use natural gas, it reduces carbon emissions by around a half. So it's not as good as wind and solar power, but it's still 50% better. But although India produces some gas, the vast majority of its gas is imported, and that comes from liquefied natural gas. So in those scenarios, we have natural gas consumption in India rising more quickly in a decarbonisation scenario than in a business as usual scenario. So in a world where their carbon emissions are falling sharply, their use of a fossil fuel actually grows more quickly because it's the only way they can get rid of coal. And all of that, vast majority of that gas will be coming via sharp increases in liquefied natural gas, with the US being one of the absolute key sources of that growth. So I think the growth of liquefied natural gas is a key component in helping parts of emerging Asia decarbonize rapidly. And Quintin, I apologize if you have something else in mind.
The only thing I'd add, Dave, is just as we were talking earlier about the demonization of coal, there is a global and fairly effective movement to try to decarbonize gas as well. Right. And so that is, you're seeing that take place with gas exports from the US headed to France, for example, recently, with concerns being raised there about whether there are too many methane emissions associated with the production of the gas. And that, of course, links back to Victoria's complaints about standardization of measurement and so forth. There is no real measurement of methane right now. It's largely done through estimates. We have committed to measure. So there's all sorts of, again, to Spencer's point, this is so far from being black and white. It's so complicated. There's such a domino effect here that it's really going to take people being very open-minded, I think, and not sort of being strident, as you're seeing right now in our home country, David. If people are in their corners and they're sort of boxing, we need to work together to find the right energy mix to sort of stave off this enormous global challenge. So we got to be very careful, I think, about demonizing fuels and figuring out how we can produce them all more cleanly.
I completely agree. And in fact, I think that speaks to a question that came from Mark, apologies, no surname, is the potential role of nuclear fuel as baseload power globally. And, it's a very interesting, nuclear has been demonized for some time, but in many ways it has a lot of the features of clean energy that people are looking for.
So it's interesting. Nearly every time I do a talk, people will always ask about nuclear energy. And so ahead of producing this year's Energy Outlook, I said to my team, can you go away and give me a scenario where nuclear energy plays a really big role? Because I just want to sort of have that to understand, go away and let's have at least one case study where it plays a big role. And in 2 weeks later, they came back empty-handed and said, we just can't do it, Spencer. I said, what do you mean you can't do it? And the answer was the following: for nuclear to play a big role, it has to play that base load. So for familiar people who are not familiar with it, if you're buying the base load, it's doing that 60 or 70% of power generation. It's doing the big bulk. And for nuclear to do that big bulk of that base load, essentially it has to outcompete wind and solar power. Because in most of our scenarios, it's wind and solar power providing that base load. That's a really hard thing to do. Wind and solar power costs have come down tremendously, that we think they're going to fall by another 60% solar power over the next 30 years. It's available pretty much everywhere. The technology can move freely across the world. If anything, the cost of nuclear energy has gone up rather than down. And so we have a key role for nuclear. It is playing a role, but it's not playing a big baseload role, because for it to do that, it has to outcompete wind and solar, which is a really hard thing. So that's why we ended up, in this time, we do have, in our scenarios, it does play a role, but we don't have a really great role for it because it's just a really hard thing for it to beat wind and solar.
All right, great, thank you. And I guess maybe we'll take the last question, because I know we're bumping up against the hour, but David Kim asked how important the lithium-ion battery, or simply the battery in collective definition, is in the efforts of carbon reduction.
I can start if you like. Very. So I think within transportation, battery costs have fallen by around 90% in the last 10, 15 years. And so that has helped significantly in terms of allowing us to produce electric vehicles, electric cars that can compete, and whose range is getting higher and higher. And as I was saying earlier, batteries will play a key role in trying to solve what we call the intermittency problem in the power sector, which is, the sun shining really strong in the middle of the day, but nobody's at home to make their cup of tea because they're all at work. And then they come home in the evening and they need to make their cup of tea because they're British, and they need to make their cup of tea. But the sun's not shining at that point. And if we can have batteries that can store the power from when the sun was shining, that helps enormously. So batteries, as always, simple answers aren't the full answer. So the idea that renewables plus batteries will solve the world isn't the answer. The world is more complicated than that, but renewables and batteries will play a very important role in solving this problem we're trying to, the world's biggest challenge, I think, that which we're trying to do in terms of produce energy to keep the world growing and prosperity rising, but doing it in a way where carbon emissions fall to zero.
Great, thank you, Spencer. All right, well, I guess we're up against the hour, so I want to thank our panelists. I think that was a really, really interesting and engaging conversation, and I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed it as much as I did. Want to thank the audience in particular for tuning in. We know that you're all busy in your various remote corners of the world, so thank you for your participation. This will be recorded, or has been recorded, so please tell your friends if they weren't able to join in that they can always access it on the university website. Want to thank our sponsors, which are the University Board of Regents, the Office of the Vice President of Global Engagement, and the Office of the Provost. And then throw in a plug for the upcoming events. As I mentioned earlier, this is the 4th of 5 webinars in the series in this semester. The last one will take place on Wednesday, the 9th of December, and that will be with Professor Michael Green, and it's on the future of Asia Pacific. So I'll be tuning into that, and hopefully you'll be joining us for that as well. So thank you all again so much, and thanks to everyone for organizing, and Stay safe and healthy, and enjoy the weekend.